In this video, we're going to go over how to solve absolute value equations. How to solve an equation that has these absolute value symbols in them. If you think about the definition of absolute value is the distance a number is from zero on a number line. So when they give you an absolute value equation, like this one right here, we could think about what kind of answers would go in for x. If I take the absolute value of something and I get 5, what could that number be? Well, the absolute value of 5 is equal to 5 because 5 is 5 spaces away from 0. Is there another number that's 5 spaces away from 0 on a number line? That would be negative 5. So when you solve absolute value equations, you need to consider the positive and negative when you find your answers. So the answer to this right here, x is equal to 5 and x is equal to negative 5. Those are the two numbers that could be this answer. What's the absolute value of 5? 5. What's the absolute value of negative 5? 5. Both of these numbers are the same distance from 0 on a number line. Once we know this, and they give us an absolute value equation, we know that we need to set up two equations to find our two answers. The way you do that is this. I'm going to take this equation right here because it's an absolute value equation, and I'm going to set up two equations from it. Those two equations are going to look like this. 2x plus 2. I take what's inside this absolute value and I write it down twice. I don't change what's inside this absolute value. And I'm going to take this number out here. I'm going to write it down once as being positive, and then I'm going to write it down once as being negative. That's how I create the two equations I'm going to solve that's going to get my two answers for x. I solve both of these equations. Using my rules, I subtract 2 from both sides, divide both sides by 2. 5 is also my answer for this one. That's one of my answers. If I put 5 in here, 5 times 2 is 10. 10 plus 2 is 12, and the absolute value of 12 is equal to 12. Solve this one, and I'll get my other answer. Subtract 2 from both sides. Negative 12 and negative 2 give me negative 14. Divide both sides by 2. Negative 7 is also an answer. If I take negative 7 and plug it back in here, 2 times negative 7 is negative 14. Negative 14 plus 2 is negative 12, and the absolute value of negative 12 is 12. So when you have absolute value equations, set up two equations considering the positive and negative and solve those two equations. When you're solving these, make sure this absolute value is isolated. Make sure there's nothing else on the outside of that absolute value symbol. If you do have a number on the outside of that absolute value symbol, you need to use your normal rules for solving an equation to get rid of that number. In this case, I need to get rid of this negative 12. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to add 12 to both sides. Absolute value, these cancel out. 100 plus 12 is 112. Once this absolute value symbol is isolated, this is the point where you make two equations. You do not change what's inside. You write that down twice. What's on the outside over here on this side of the equal sign is what changes. One time you write it down as positive, the other time you write it down as negative. These are the two equations you need to solve to determine what the answers are to this absolute value equation. Subtract 2 from both sides. 112 minus 2 is 110. Divide both sides by negative 2. X is equal to negative 55. I need to do the exact same thing over here. Solve this one. The steps are going to be the same. I'm just going to be dealing with different numbers. Negative 112 minus 2 . Divide both sides by negative 2. A negative divided by a negative is a positive. 114 divided by 2. These are my two answers to this absolute value equation. Another rule or another concept that we need to remember about absolute value equations. If you try to take the absolute value of something and get a negative number, that's impossible. Most of these absolute value equations have two answers. There are some that don't have any answer. Remember, the absolute value is the distance a number is from 0 on a number line. A distance cannot be negative. Therefore, you cannot take the absolute value of something and it be equal to a negative number. It's impossible. So, if they give you a situation like this, there is nothing you can work out. You simply write down, there is no solution to this. So when they give you a problem that looks like this, and you're trying to take the absolute value of something, doesn't matter what's inside here, and it's equal to a negative number, the answer is no solution. Now, if there's numbers on the outside of this absolute value symbol, you need to go through your normal procedures to get rid of those numbers. But once the absolute value symbol is isolated and it's equal to a negative number, then you write down no solution, because there is no solution for this. So we're going to work a couple of examples. They want us to solve the absolute value of 4x minus 8 equals 20. There are no numbers on the outside of this absolute value symbol. This is not negative, so that means I'm going to make two equations. What's inside the absolute value symbol, I write that down twice. And then this number on the outside, on this side of the equal sign, one time I write it down as positive, the other time I write it down as negative. And I solve this. I solve both of these equations. Add 8 to both sides. Divide both sides by 4. 28 divided by 4, 7. Same thing here. The opposite of negative 8, positive 8. Negative 20 and positive 8, negative 12. Divide both sides by 4. X is equal to negative 3. These are my two solutions for this absolute value equation. Let's solve this absolute value equation. There are numbers on the outside. Before I can make two equations, I need to get rid of these numbers out here. You follow your rules for solving an equation. I need to do my adding and subtracting before I do my multiplying and dividing. So that means I need to add 3 to both sides. What do I need to do to get rid of this 2 right here? This 2 is being multiplied. Opposite of multiplying, dividing. Just like any equation, you're not always going to get a whole number. You can get fractions. This is the point where I make two equations. Remember, you take what's inside the absolute value symbol, you write it down twice, and then you take what's out here. One time you write it down as being positive, the other time you write it down as being negative. These are my two answers, positive 11 halves and negative 11 halves. We need to solve this absolute value equation. I don't see any numbers on the outside out here, but I do notice that this is equal to negative 1. As soon as I see this, I cannot take the absolute value of anything and get a negative number. I simply tell everybody that there's no solution to this. You cannot take the absolute value of something and get a negative number. So the previous problem, we sat there and looked and go, oh, there's a negative number here. Just because there's a negative number here doesn't mean that this doesn't have a solution. For that to work, I cannot have any numbers on the outside out here. If I do have numbers on the outside, I need to get rid of those numbers. To get rid of this positive 6, I subtract 6. Negative 111 minus 6, negative 117. To get rid of this negative 3, it's being multiplied to this. The opposite of multiplying is dividing. I need to divide both sides by negative 3. A negative divided by a negative is a positive. 117 divided by 3. This is the point where I determine if this number out here is negative, then there's no solution. This number is positive, so I need to keep going. Once this absolute value symbol is isolated, this is when you make two equations. What's inside this absolute value symbol stays the same. You write it down twice. This number, one time you write it down being positive, the other time you write it down being negative. And these are the two equations that you solve. Add 9 to both sides. Divide both sides by negative 3. Negative 16. Add 9 to both sides over here. Negative 39 plus 9 is negative 30. Divide both sides by negative 3. Negative divided by negative is a positive. These are my two answers for this absolute value equation.